Hi friends, if you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help me reach even more people with thinking faith, please consider supporting the show. Silver supporters get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed books and a monthly catch-up with me. The links to support are with the show notes or visit justinbrierley.com. Enjoy today's episode.
Hey everybody, just a little bit of a somber note as we start the podcast, something that's never happened before, but I have to report on the passing of today's guest, Daniel Dennett. He passed away today, I'm informed. This is Friday, April 19th, 2024.
Earlier today, myself and others on the Atheists for Liberty team learned about the death of Daniel Dennett. He's one of the most famous atheists in the world, and he shaped the 21st century. I'm going to miss him. We're down to two horsemen now.
Of the four horsemen of atheist philosophy, Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, and Harris, Dennett was the one that I resonated with the most.
And I hope that Dan is happy and resting in peace wherever he is. Thanks, Dan.
The recent death of atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett at the age of 82, following complications from lung disease, took everyone by surprise, myself included. Only days before his passing, I'd heard him engaging in podcast and radio interviews, continuing to promote the ideas he was best known for in best-selling books such as Darwin's Dangerous Idea and Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon. His fellow horseman of the New Atheism, Richard Dawkins, paid a heartfelt tribute.
Daniel Dennett was a big man in every way. Tall, upright, imposing build, massive intellect, big sense of humor, big-hearted generosity when crediting others, including those less gifted than himself. A formidably big gun in the attack against cant and pretension, superstition and illogic. Big books, eloquent speaker, deep knowledge of science as well as philosophy, talented musician and sculptor, lived a full life and died in harness, leaves a huge gap in the world of the intellect. Dan will miss you so much, so deeply.
In this archive interview, Dennett himself reflected on the nature of mortality with Richard Dawkins.
A dear professor of mine just died just a few days ago, and I've been thinking quite a bit about it. And the idea that he lives for eternity in heaven doesn't give me any consolation at all. The idea that his memory lives on with his children and his friends and his colleagues. And of course, he has his work, or he had his work, which will live on. Not everybody gets that kind of legacy. And I think that for those that we love that die young or without that sort of issue, the best consolation is just that they had a chance. They got to be on this stupendous planet and live for a while, and they may have suffered. And I think seeing our suffering in the guise of the whole cosmos can make it seem not quite so earth-shatteringly special. Yeah, we suffer, but we're not filled with fear and trembling at the thought that there were all those years before we were alive. So it shouldn't bother us that there are going to be all those years when we're not alive.
Mark Twain, I think, said, I was dead for billions and billions of years before I was born and never suffered the slightest inconvenience.
Yeah, right, sure.
If it is true that we live on only in people's memories, then Dennett will doubtless be remembered both for his sharp mind and intellect and, like his good friend Dawkins, for his championing of a purely material Darwinist perspective on life.
Before Darwin, I think it was impossible to imagine how this gap between the living and the non-living was really filled in. And now we have a pretty good understanding of not only what the materials and the structures are, but how it got that way.
Dan was a Darwinist with a capital D.
This is Professor Bob Stewart speaking to Cameron Bertuzzi about Dennett's philosophical approach.
He was an evolutionist, not simply buying into or accepting the theory of biological speciation, that sort of thing. He bought into evolutionism, that the universe is evolving, and that everything is progressing, and that Darwin simply put his finger on the recipe. And I had an interesting experience with him. I tried to share the gospel with him over dinner, and we were out at dinner, and I looked him in the eye and I said, well, Dan, I really am an evangelical Christian, and I really would like to see everyone give their life to Jesus Christ, even you. And then he launched into this soliloquy, and it was so informative about how he thought. He said, I'm a Darwinist first and an atheist second.
I had the privilege myself of meeting Dennett in 2018. So Keith and Daniel, welcome along to the program. Great
Delighted to be here.
Dennett had joined me along with Christian philosopher Keith Ward as a guest on The Big Conversation from Premier Unbelievable. We're going to be talking about consciousness, the mind, free will, huge topics, and we won't be able to do them full justice in the course of the time we have today. But perhaps before we get into it, a little introduction to you both. Dan, are you happy to wear the label atheist? Is that something you've called yourself for a long time?
I'm happy to wear the label. For years I didn't bother, but then it seemed that, especially in the United States, there was a sort of theocratic boom. And it seemed important just to tell people, you don't have to make a big deal of it. Just say, no, I'm an atheist, and a lot of atheists.
The debate between Ward and Dennett was an intellectually thrilling affair, covering many of the key claims of Dennett's materialist philosophy of mind, that we are really just our physical brain, and that our sense of self and conscious experience is an illusion.
That's what consciousness is. It's a user illusion that is designed by evolution and by learning and by cultural evolution to make our brains
useful,
capable,
in a sense,
of getting our bodies through this complicated world.
Yes, see, at that point, I have to say that what you call an illusion is, to me, the most important thing there is. My sense of the importance of my experience would be vastly undermined if I thought it was really all completely caused by a booming conglomeration of atoms.
Why?
The question of purpose was also a significant point of disagreement between the two thinkers.
Nature is awash in purposes. They're not generated from the top down by the great purpose giver, God. They emerge from the bottom up from a purposeless process. That's the genius of Darwin's idea.
Right. Well, I think that's a heroic project.
It is.
It is, but I don't think it's a possible one.
I too couldn't help getting involved in the debate at some points, particularly on the question of free will. Daniel Dennett was a well-known advocate of determinism, the view that human free will is an illusion because everything, every choice, thought and action are ultimately determined by the physical processes in our brain. And our brain itself is just a product of a long, unpurposed process of physical causes and effects that goes back to the beginning of the universe. Determinism means that if you wound the clock back to the same physical state at the beginning of it all, everything would play out in exactly the same way. You couldn't change a thing. As we'll hear later in today's episode, this has all kinds of implications, but I've always seen a particular problem with this for the atheist determinist, and I wanted to put it to Dan. You're an atheist, Dan, but if all our past events are physically determined at some level, isn't your decision to be an atheist simply an accumulation of those past events? And you haven't, in a sense, decided to be an atheist. You are simply the product of a set of determined
accumulation events. Is it? It is one that's been accomplished by machinery that has been designed by evolution over billions of years to do a very good job of telling truth from falsehood and of not drawing unlicensed conclusions.
If everything is ultimately determined, that you were going to be here and have this conversation, if you were around the clock perfectly, it would all happen in exactly the same way. Isn't your decision to be an atheist and Keith's decision to be a Christian ultimately simply a factor of that? There's no ultimate sense in which we've freely chosen anything in our life, and therefore can we even speak of the reasons and the truth-seeking and so on that we value?
Maybe there's an ultimate sense of freedom in which neither Keith nor I nor you are free, but that's not one that cuts any ice when it comes to the question of whether we have reasons.
What do you think about this, Keith?
I think reasoning is difficult. Indeed, I think it's impossible to account for in purely physical terms, because to try and think about something, decide whether or not it's true, if you have a hard problem of some sort, that is not like handing it over to your brain to solve. It's like doing some really hard thinking, and that's the problem. That seems to be a directed process. That there is a you, which is.
What else would you want to make you do it? As you, I mean,
and why for you
wouldn't want somebody else's brain?
Why isn't it ultimately your brain that made you do it? Yeah. In your view?
Because I think I use my brain. I mean, I think.
There's a me using the brain.
You are a dualist.
Well, that's such a dirty word. But yes, I do believe there is something other than the brain which ultimately makes human choices and finds human meaning and has human purposes. Yes, I do.
I thoroughly enjoyed chairing this big conversation between Daniel Dennett and Keith Ward, and there's a link from today's episode to the full show. I may have disagreed with many of Dennett's conclusions, but he had a great mind and was a brilliant communicator. But his recent death also reminded me that these aren't just abstract philosophical questions. Whether we are simply our physical brain, or whether we have a soul that can outlive the death of our body, whether we're ultimately part of a predetermined clockwork universe or not, whether we truly have a sense of self and free will, or that's just an illusion, these are all questions that have significance both now and in eternity. As we enter the 6th act of our documentary series, we'll be addressing these big questions. Yes, this will be a deep dive, but fear not, I'll be your guide, aiming to keep things as accessible as possible, as we discover why a rebirth of belief in God is happening in the world of mind, materialism, and meaning. I'm Justin Brierley, and throughout my working life, I've been hosting conversations on faith between atheists, agnostics, and believers. In this documentary series, I'm telling the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. I'm speaking to those inside and outside the atheist movement and the many new thinkers beginning a new conversation on the value of faith. Along the way, we'll meet some of those who have found themselves surprised by God as they've made the journey from atheism to Christianity. Welcome to the surprising rebirth of belief in God, episode 23, Emerging from the Meaning Crisis. Well, just before we get into the rest of today's show, someone we've heard from quite a bit on the podcast is author and speaker Glenn Scrivener. Hello, Glenn.
Hey, Justin. Always great to be here.
Well, for a while now, you've been happily pointing people to your online course 321. Where did that come from?
It's a passion of mine to help people get to grips with Christian faith and to do it in a way that's attractive and imaginative and deep and that assumes no prior knowledge. So 321 is my way of showing life according to Jesus. We want it to be like a mere Christianity for a digital age.
Okay, so that sounds like it's maybe more for those who are not Christians?
Well, yeah, many people have done it who are not Christians, and they've found faith for the first time. We're thrilled about that. But like with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Christians love that book too. And the first audience we have in mind for 321 is actually a Christian who wants to be refreshed in their faith and to have something to pass on to their Christian curious friends and family.
Okay, so Christian or not, this basically gets people to the heart of the faith.
Right, and nearly 10,000 people have joined the online platform. It's free. You watch these video-led sessions and you think through the stunning animations, you engage with the chat community, you get a ton of extra content thrown in, and now you have on your phone a Mere Christianity that you can share with others. So the phrase we're using is, you can share this without shame, without cost, and without delay.
Well, we've been really enjoying promoting 321, and listeners to this podcast can get into it instantly by going to 321course.com/JB. That's 321course.com/JB. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Justin. Keep up the good work.
I'm taking the plunge. I'm getting baptized. What's been explained to me is it's an opportunity to die and be reborn, an opportunity to leave the past behind and be reborn in Christ's name, like it says in Galatians.
This is celebrity comedian and actor Russell Brand announcing earlier this year that he had decided to get baptized.
I know a lot of people are sort of cynical about the increasing interest in Christianity and the return to God, but to me it's obvious. As meaning deteriorates in the modern world, as our value systems and institutions crumble, all of us become increasingly aware that there is this eerily familiar, awakening and beckoning figure that we've all known all of our lives, within us and around us. And for me, it's very exciting. One of my concerns is I'm thinking about doing it in the River Thames, so I could be getting sort of baptized in toxoplasmosis and E. coli based on what I've learned. So I may be leaving behind the sins, but I might be picking up some pretty serious viruses. Let me know what you guys think about it and how you feel about it.
A lot of people sent me this video of Brand's announcement and the subsequent account of his baptism in the Thames, assisted by TV adventurer and committed Christian Bear Grylls. I followed Brand's story of going from drug-fueled, sex-addicted celebrity to recovering spiritual seeker with great interest. So seeing this recent culmination of his journey in Christian baptism seems to overlap strongly with the thesis that there is a change afoot in our culture. However, it's important to also mention that there are outstanding allegations against Brand of historic sexual assault and emotional abuse from several women. Brand, while recognising his former life was extremely promiscuous, has denied the allegations. Having seen many hot takes for and against Russell Brand's recent conversion and baptism, I'm left personally convinced that forgiveness and transformation are available to anyone. But that shouldn't stop justice being done if there are wrongs that need to be addressed. It'll be important, therefore, to watch carefully as events unfold, both for Brand's newfound profession of faith and how he approaches these serious questions about his past. But whatever you make of his story, I think the increasingly materialist and meaningless nature of our contemporary culture described by Brand has only accelerated in recent years.
Doctors, psychologists, and therapists are treating teens for depression and anxiety at a greater rate than ever before.
And according to research, teens say anxiety and depression are the most critical issues among their peers.
Yeah, researchers at Florida Atlantic University have found that suicide rates are climbing among 13 and 14-year-olds. The study found that suicide rates for teens more than doubled from 2008 to 2018. It coincides with more use of social media.
One of the key voices recently speaking out on the rise in mental health problems in young people linked to technology is psychologist Jonathan Haidt.
I mean, I hate to catastrophize, but it is a tidal wave. It is an epidemic of mental illness. It hit kids in all the English-speaking countries in 2013, plus or minus a year. It hit girls especially hard in the same way. The rates of self-harm and hospitalization for self-harm skyrocketed for girls in all the English-speaking countries at the same time.
This is Haidt speaking to Elizabeth Oldfield, host of the Sacred podcast, about his recent book, Anxious Generation.
Once we were solid on the evidence that it's international, it starts around 2013, and it's very closely linked to social media. So in 2010, very few kids have an iPhone. In 2015, the great majority of kids do. So between 2010 and 2015, we went from flip phone with low-speed internet and no apps to iPhone with a high-speed internet, unlimited data plan, and 1 million apps, especially Instagram. Facebook buys Instagram in 2012. That's the year that the huge publicity, that's when all the girls get on, is 2012. And 2013 is when their mental health falls off a cliff.
So concerned is Haidt that he has outlined a manifesto for legally banning smartphones before high school with no social media before age 16.
What are your hopes for it? If it does what you long for, what will it change?
So first, I'm in the very enviable position that I'm trying to create social change. I'm trying to change childhood. I'm trying to roll back the phone-based childhood and restore the play-based childhood. Now, that sounds insane. That sounds like an insanely ambitious project to change childhood, not just in America, but in all of the English-speaking countries. But I'm in the enviable position that almost everybody is fed up with the phones. The parents hate them. It's their main worry about childhood. It's not that their kid will get pregnant or abducted. It's literally that they're going to be scrambled by this phone-based life. Everyone hates it. The right and the left actually agree. It's one of the only issues in America where left and right agree. The kids don't even like it. If you survey them, surveys show if you say, what if TikTok and Instagram were never invented? Would the world be a better place? They mostly say yes. They wish it didn't exist. Why are you on it then? They all say the same thing. Because everyone else is. I have to be. So it's a social trap. It's what's called it's called a collective action problem in the social sciences.
You may be asking yourself, how does all this relate to where we began today's show? The philosophical questions of whether we live in a purely material world of cause and effect with illusions of consciousness, purpose, and free will. The answer is that I believe the mental health crisis in young people, fueled by digital addiction and social media, is part of a wider meaning crisis, which I believe has the materialist story of reality at the center of it. We'll explore that story of reality later on in today's podcast, but for now, I want to paint you a bigger picture of how this meaning crisis has been percolating in our culture for some time. Let me introduce you to Jordan Hall, a tech pioneer who's been thinking about and researching the unique challenges of our tech-driven age for many years. Hall is famous for building early internet companies such as the video codec DivX that forms the basis of the vast amounts of video that now exist online.
The reason why it's relevant is because that was the part of the major push of infrastructure that made things like this Zoom call possible, right? Turning the internet from a mostly text and image medium, effectively newspapers sent over, what do they call them? The system of tubes, to videos, which of course nowadays is, I think it's the dominant form of video, right? It's utterly replaced cable, and is a sizable fraction of all of the relationships that are mediated on the internet are video. So that was both the intent, right, the recognition that video is a very powerful medium. And if we can move video from a medium that is fundamentally broadcast in nature to one that is fundamentally decentralized in nature, that will have somewhat predictable, but certainly profound cultural consequences. And of course, I happened to be starting it in the window where that window of opportunity was available. So then, of course, it could be a successful business.
Hall is something of a polymath, and by the time he had made his fortune in tech, he was already beginning to theorize that the rapid advance of technology and globalization was creating the conditions for a cataclysmic set of events.
Had been now invited in to fly on private jets to fancy parties or to big institutions and participate with people who were in fact, in some sense, still are famous in tech, industry, business, banking, politics, science, etc. And so I had exposure to that at the time when the financial crisis was unfolding. So what I got to see was the emperor's lack of clothing up front, and to see that the underlying cultural technological move was actually unfolding as theorized, and that therefore things were going to get very shaky.
Hall told me how he and those he works with coined the phrase meta-crisis to refer to a set of interlinked global challenges, including environmental, social, and technological issues, which, if not responded to strategically and intentionally, could spell disaster.
The magnitude of change that we're undergoing is of the 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 year magnitude. Just kind of a Richter scale style way of just sort of modeling it. And so the kinds of agency that we would have to apply and the things to which we would have to apply agency have to be the kinds of things that endure over those timescales.
Would you mind being kind of somewhat explicit of what the worst case scenario is that you and the others were foretelling, or indeed may still see ahead of us?
The end of the world, almost certainly, by the way. I'll give you an example. I was actually at a conference in 2016. Many of the people at the conference had access to high quality information at a global level. And we were looking at things like depleting freshwater reserves, increasing population, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the conclusions that began to be drawn was there was likely to be an increasing conflict on a global level. And that most of the scenarios that came out of the analysis showed a 1 to 3 billion person death toll by the end of the century. But what happens when people become extremely focused to, say, a fully dedicated arms race with no holds barred, which, by the way, is something that we're beginning to progressively move into. I don't know if you've noticed. So you have an increase in the destructive power of technology driven by an increasingly desperate conflict among increasingly desperate people. And 1 to 3 billion quickly becomes 9. As, of course, we're living on top of a hyper-complicated total civilization structure, which is also quite fragile. And so between 2010 and 2014, something like 100 or 150 people, more or less, who had independently come to something like the same conclusion, began to find each other over that period of time, not all at once. And as we compared notes, all coming from very different backgrounds and perspectives and areas of expertise and access to information, we discovered that the circumstances, generally speaking, were worse than we thought, meaning, oh, you know this world very well. How's it doing? Oh my gosh, you have no idea how bad it is. Oh, that's not good. I modeled it at bad 4. You're saying it's bad 8. And as we began to multiply the effects together, the implications were worse, not better. Not universally, but generally speaking, as a trend line.
I was pretty shocked to hear things set out in such apocalyptic terms, yet Jordan Hall isn't a crackpot conspiracy theorist and has worked alongside tech and industry leaders to find a solution. Interestingly, as we'll hear towards the end of today's episode, Hall, an agnostic for most of his life, has also recently had a surprising life change that has made him think again about what can actually save us. But for now, this rather grim analysis about the various ways modern civilization is capable of destroying itself gives some background to why we live in such anxious times of meaning, mental health, and meta-crises.
It might, at first glance, be fairly obvious why so many of us are so stressed, so unfulfilled, so anxious, so depressed, because we've actually done our best to destroy social cohesiveness.
This is psychiatrist and philosopher Iain McGilchrist speaking on the Freedom Pact podcast.
We've done our best to vandalize and subdue nature, and we box ourselves up in little urban boxes instead of living alongside it, in the rhythms of it, in the depths of communion with it. And we've also decided that really only perhaps simpletons still believe that there might be something like the divine or a soul or God.
In his best-selling books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things, McGilchrist takes the popular notion of the split between the left and right brain and applies it at a whole new level. McGilchrist's thesis is that with the prolific rise of science and technology, left-brained thinking now rules a culture in which the world can be explained mechanistically and where the role of intuition and imagination has been sidelined, and we are seeing its devastating consequences.
We've invented the term a meta-crisis to overarch the whole set of problems. I think these are all, if you like, explicable in terms of a world in which we pay attention only to what the left hemisphere can tell us and neglect what the right hemisphere can tell us. This was not always so. But we now are so focused on material acquisition, on the getting of stuff, that we've forgotten that the business of life depends on many other things, and that it is the things that are being forgotten that enrich life and make it worth living. This is why I think there is an epidemic of mental illness, because it's not normal for us to be cut off from one another in a fragmented society. It's not normal for us to be cut off from nature. This is a very, very new and isolated phenomenon, that we live these worlds remote from the natural order of things.
A part of the meaning crisis that we're experiencing is that everyone's been given the burden to create meaning for themselves, and they're discovering that that's not a coherent way of making meaning in the world. It's not satisfying. They want more.
This is Christian thinker Alan Noble, author of books including You Are Not Your Own. He told me how his experience of being a teacher at university led him to see the pressures on young people growing up in the social media-fueled world of liquid modernity as individuals with gender and sexual identities that are fluid and an endless number of choices about how to express themselves. A world where we belong to ourselves rather than any bigger story that gives us our sense of who we are.
And then attached to that meaning crisis, I think, is a crisis of existential justification, right? So what is your purpose, right? So that's tied into this crisis of meaning. What is your purpose? And that purpose is another one of those burdens that belonging to yourself gives you. You have to figure out purpose for yourself. I can give you recommendations. I can say, you're very talented at doing podcasts, so you should do something like that. But there's no one in authority who can tell you what your purpose is. Gurus just offer suggestions. There are no leaders. That's what Zygmunt Bauman says in Liquid Modernity, the book he wrote. I think part of that meaning crisis is this sense that we have to figure out purpose for ourselves. There's so many different purposes possible, and you feel like you just fold in on yourself. And inherently, just like with meaning, inherently, you feel like purpose should be something given to you, something from God, the universe, something external, some transcendent source, some kind of authority. And I think people are feeling an ache for that.
Noble's most recent book, On Getting Out of Bed in the Morning, is an extended essay on the burden and gift of living and examines the way this meaning crisis has sparked a mental health crisis.
I think when you take a step back and you look at the society that we've built for ourselves, it makes sense that people are depressed and anxious. Now I'm not remotely saying that all instances of mental illness or depression or anxiety are just socially constructed. But I do think when you step back and look, the kind of pressures that we've been talking about today, all the pressures on young people to create and craft an identity, the pressure to find meaning and purpose for yourself, these things can be crippling to people. They feel overwhelmed. A data scientist named Ryan Burge describes as the dropouts, those who are not attending church, who are not voting, who are not attending political rallies. They're not engaged in social life at all. And I think it's that inhibition. And I think part of that, we have to be able to say that at least part of that is socially constructed.
Others have noted this dropout effect in terms of the virtual exodus, increasing numbers of adults who have given up on pursuing real-life goals because of the rewards of the online gaming world, which are so much easier to attain. Writing for The Economist on the game drain, Ryan Avent says that today's games seem to be displacing careers, friendships and families, and thus stopping young people, particularly men, from starting real adult lives.
And I guess that's a real possibility, isn't it? We could literally kind of replace our real life, if you like, with an alternative in that way.
Historically, it's super fascinating to me because in the past, to drop out of life, you would just starve. You can't just drop out of, because your community is where you find all of your identity and your connections and your family and your work. But today, you can work a very low paying job that has low requirements on you physically or mentally, and then go home and with relatively little money have infinite access to entertainment. That's historically bizarre. I mean, it just was not the case. You would not have that kind of stimulation, and so you could live a life where weed, pornography, video games, scrolling through social media, you can check out of life and just fundamentally give up while still being highly entertained. Now, that's not a satisfying life, and I think people living that kind of life, I'm sure they suffer from deep depression and loneliness, but you can numb yourself perpetually.
This may all sound pretty depressing, right? A meta crisis, along with a meaning crisis, breeding a mental health crisis. But I believe these may also be the conditions under which people are beginning to look for meaning again. In previous episodes, we've met Elizabeth Oldfield, host of the Sacred Podcast and author of the new book, Fully Alive. Elizabeth and her family have chosen to live in a small, intentional Christian community, a micro-monastery, you could say. She recently joined myself and Belle Tyndall on the Reenchanting podcast to talk about why she believes we need to bring the wisdom of communal life back into the picture to help us meet the problems of living in a highly individualistic age.
Our attempts to make meaning, if that's around the project, flow from that, right? I must make my own meaning. I must tell my own story. I must test and approve all of the wisdom of the world.
Yeah.
And then select the bits that chime with my personal temperament and my preferences, because we are formed into consumers. And that sounds really nice in theory. And I just think it's terrible for us in practice. It makes us lonely and overwhelmed. And so the fundamental real sort of assumption that runs through the book and in everything that I try and do in my life is there's no such thing as an individual. We are interrelated, interdependent. The sociological term is hypersocial creatures. The theological term is made in the image of a Trinitarian God, designed to see and be seen, to know and be known, to be so enmeshed with each other that the idea of us as an individual begins to break down. Mm-hmm. And so when you lose traditions, when you lose wisdom paths, when you lose intergenerational transfer of knowledge, what you get is a lot of lonely, overwhelmed people trying to make a world of meaning for themselves when they were never meant to. Mm-hmm. And so more and more, I am very suspicious of anything that's like, this is about me and my path. This is about me and my growth. This is about me and my destiny. This is about me and my dreams. It's a lie. It's a trap. Yeah. It sounds nice and it's not.
So much of the self-help stuff is essentially about the focus is on the individual and about how do you achieve your life goals and how do you, get to your level of physical fitness. And very rarely does it ever kind of suggest joining something bigger than you, where you would maybe have to sacrifice, something of your own preferences.
Yeah, or that even the fundamental conception of flourishing is collective.
Yeah.
That there actually isn't such a thing.
Yeah.
Of one person flourishing on their own.
Yeah.
In a network of relationships that aren't working, right? That the possibility of disentanglement from each other is a lie, but it drives us further apart, and so we remain entangled, but in tension, in fractured, dislocated relationships. Sure. And so that's kind of what I mean by communal. I am less and less interested in a thing that is going to repeatedly form me into individualism.
Alan Noble also believes that we shouldn't ignore the spiritual dimension of what we're seeing in our world.
One of the dangers about our, in generally very good attitude about mental health today, just this openness to it and acknowledgement that it's real. One of the downsides is that we've gotten to a place where many people don't acknowledge the spiritual realm either, or the cultural realm. And so as we've been talking today, we've discussed how society contributes to the anxiety and depression that we're feeling. And Jonathan Haidt, I think, has made that case with social media, for example. And once you recognize that, then you recognize, if trying to craft an identity on Instagram is leaving me depressed and anxious, where should I get my identity? And that's where we need those spiritual answers that ultimately satisfy. And so hopefully, my hope would be that that Christians would be out there offering that example, offering that answer to those kinds of questions.
What is the reason you give for someone to get out of bed in the morning? If you could boil it down, I suppose, into a few sentences, what would be the nub of the reason why you think it is worth getting out of bed?
Two reasons, and they're connected. One is because you were intentionally created and sustained by a loving God who knows you. And that intentional creation was for you to live a life that's good, a life and life abundantly, as Christ says. And the second reason is that your choice to get out of bed is a witness to other people. It testifies, it says that life is worth living even when you are going through great suffering. And that allows other people to feel that themselves and to believe that themselves. We can only do what we imagine. And if you only have people around you who give up, then it's going to be hard for you to imagine that you can persevere through hard times. And so it's so important for us to show that we can endure.
Earlier in this series, we profiled how former New Atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali has embraced Christianity after becoming convinced it's the only thing that can withstand civilizational breakdown, and the only thing that helped her through a personal meaning crisis. She spoke about beginning to attend church in a dialogue with Richard Dawkins at the recent Dissident Dialogues event in New York. After being challenged by Dawkins that she can't really believe all the nonsense the vicar says on a Sunday, Hirsi Ali said this.
So I think because you, and I know you very well, we've been friends for a long time. And in fact, in some ways, I think of you as a mentor. I would say you're coming at this from a place of there is nothing. And what has happened to me is I think I have accepted there is something. And when you accept that there is something and there is a powerful entity, for me, the God that turned me around, I think what the vicar is saying no longer sounds nonsensical. It makes a great deal of sense. And not only does it make a great deal of sense, it's also layered with the wisdom of millennia. And so, like you, I did mock faith in general, and probably Christianity in particular, but I don't do that anymore. And again, that is where the humility comes into it, is it doesn't seem, in 2024, after I went through that experience, it doesn't seem nonsensical to me, and it doesn't, I don't mock it. I think I've come down to my knees to say, perhaps those people who've always had faith have something that we who lost faith don't have. And people who have faith also, like the woman who told me, well, you've tried everything and you've lost hope, you've lost faith. Try it, pray. I think just in that one word, there is so much wisdom and that it's. I am stuttering and I'm staggering to say. I'm just trying to say no. It's not stupid. It's in fact it's clever and it's wise.
In both my book and this podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I've been charting the rise in spiritual openness among secular intellectuals like Hirsi Ali, sparked by the meaning crisis. But when reviewing my book, Elizabeth Oldfield challenged me to look further than just the conservative-leaning figures that tend to dominate this conversation.
You know, you and I are very much on the same page that I am seeing a huge uptick in spiritual openness. It's easy for Christians to be both most comfortable with and find easiest to find stories of people who sit on the kind of right on centre right and have come really because of a sense of alignment with values, or Ayaan Hirsi Ali might be one of those. Mm-hmm. One, I think all those individual stories are more complex. And two, I think I am seeing an equal level of spiritual openness opening up in different tribes. And so environmentalism, for example, there is a large number of people who have given their life to trying to halt or slow down the climate crisis and are now often in despair, right? And what they're coming up against is the broken, the breaking thingsness of us. Yeah.
I think of a Paul Kingsnorth in that sort of
background in the environmental movement. There are people, and this Martin Shaw would sit in this box a bit more, who have been in the more animist, kind of nature oriented spirituality, ritual and practice, sort of overlaps on one end with a kind of New Age spirituality. And, you know, I'm always nervous of the language because I don't want to kind of self-describe for people who will be like, that's not how I think of myself. But those kind of moving groups of people who are seeking wisdom, who are seeking meaning, who are often deeply morally profound. There's a lot going on there. And it's causing some challenges, right? Paul Kingsnorth, Martin Shaw, other people in that network, a lot of people feel a bit betrayed, right? That because their associations with Christianity is of people who hate them. And that is toxic, that their associations are something that not as someone who comes to love their neighbor, but someone who will hate them and judge them. That is not a welcome posture. And I'm doing an event in a few weeks online with a friend because I think there is a huge thing happening with people who are taking psychedelics and moving from a very closed atheist materialist worldview into something much more spiritually open. And that's taking people in all different directions. And I have all kinds of questions about what it means and what's healthy and what's unhealthy and how the church should respond. I do not have a clear policy on this yet. But what I can say is many of the people who want to come and talk about Jesus are in the aftermath of using psychedelics. And I just want to know how to be of use to them.
We'll be exploring the new turn towards psychedelics in a future episode of this series, but I resonate with everything Elizabeth says here about the new openness among seekers. One of those seekers, arguably, is Russell Brand, someone Elizabeth herself has been interviewed by in the past. The morning after being baptized, he posted a video to his millions of followers describing a feeling of newness of life he had never experienced before. Whatever you think of Brand's journey and the important questions that still surround him, his words seem to capture why so many like him are turning to faith as an alternative to the meaning crisis.
It's interesting to me that people en masse, in particular young people, are recognizing that the material world that I sought to find solace and comfort in is no longer serving that function for many young people. That's extraordinary, isn't it? People are waking up, people are realizing it doesn't work, it isn't going to work. When I was a kid, I was thinking, hedonism, excitement, glory, as well as being sort of scarred with a pretty painful addiction and an emptiness. But I've heard a lot of Christians say that that is almost a defining attribute, that we need a direct relationship with Christ, and without that relationship we will feel hollow and empty and bereaved. For me, this is a new discovery. It is a surrender undertaken in gratitude and in sincerity. And I know that it's not something I'll be able to undertake perfectly, but for the first time in my life, I fully understand that I'm not at the center of my universe. And I say that as a parent. I've got 3 really, really beautiful kids I'm devoted to and dedicated to. But now I know that my function here is to be of service and to be guided and to no longer be in autonomous or authoritative control. For me, I've done what I believe is unavoidable, inevitable, necessary for me, for all of the exotic exploration, for all of the various drugs and substances, for all of the esoteric practices. I found it in that humble place that was at the end of my arm, at the end of my street, sat at bus stops, sat in churches, droned on about in school assemblies, in Christianity, and in particular in the figure of Christ.
I believe the reason we are seeing a new spiritual openness among many public figures and in our culture is that we all need a story to live by. For millennia in the West, that has been the Judeo-Christian story. As we've lost that story, it's sent people on a search for other stories to make sense of life. However, as new generations seek to carve out identity and meaning in a world devoid of both, they're often unaware that an alternative narrative has already replaced the Judeo-Christian story. It is, if you like, the background hum, the assumed fact, the white noise of our present-day culture. It is the materialist account of reality. And this particular story goes under other names too, such as naturalism and physicalism. But whatever the name, it is ultimately a story which says there is no story. Here's Ian McGilchrist explaining why the dominance of a left hemispheric approach in the sciences, which sees the universe as mechanical, has come to dominate our culture generally.
We're so arrogant that we think we know it all. And a lot of unfortunately, the voices of certain kinds of science, mainly biologists, some of them are very well-known household names, so I don't need to mention them, but they do seem to be banging an idea that everything is mechanical. And, physics left us behind 100 years ago or more. Biology is entering a very exciting stage in which at last, I think, that mechanical model is crumbling and is no longer sustainable. And people are suddenly, a lot of biologists talking very interestingly about things that will be as puzzling to biology and demanding a new way of thinking as the findings of quantum mechanics were for physicists. So we need to change our way of thinking. We need to stop looking at the world as a heap of resource for our exploitation. Me, me, me. It's what I want, and I can do it, and I will do it. If it benefits me, to the hell with the rest of you. I mean, this is a terrible, terrible way to think, and has never been admired in any society since the beginning of time until now.
This materialist, atomized, mechanistic view of nature and life dominates our thinking. As we heard in our previous act, it is the story that has been projected onto our cosmos by many materialist thinkers, that the universe came from nowhere and is heading towards extinction, driven purely by the blind forces of nature. But in such a story, any concepts of purpose, meaning, beauty, and morality are the inventions of human minds, selected for their survival value by the blind forces of evolutionary biology. As such, they are ultimately illusions, imposed on us by forces we have no control over. There is no ultimate meaning to life when we are the happy or sometimes unhappy accident of an indifferent universe. Now, we've spoken of many crises so far. The meaning crisis, the meta crisis, the mental health crisis, all accelerated by technology and modern life. But I believe they all stem from the underlying story we've imbibed, this mechanistic, materialist story, which brings us back to Daniel Dennett and the New Atheist thinkers, and just why the story of reality they have been telling us has been so corrosive to our souls. Thanks to Gareth, who wrote in to say, whether you're a person of faith, agnostic, atheist, or none of the above, this series is both genuinely thought-provoking and inspiring. I could not recommend it highly enough. Leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts or simply posting about us on your social media helps others to discover the show. If you want to follow more of my work, why not get my fortnightly newsletter? I'll even send you the first chapter of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book for free when you subscribe. And if you'd like to support the show, you can get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters will receive signed copies of both my books. For the newsletter and to support, visit justinbrierley.com or the links with today's show.
What is devs?
This is the only principle you need to understand. Nothing ever happens without a reason. Everything was determined by something prior.
They're fanatics. We need the police.
You want to take them down? It's impossible.
You knew I was going to come here.
The sense that you were participating in life was only ever an illusion. Life is just something we watch unfold.
What's inside?
Everything.
This is the trailer for the 2020 science fiction thriller Devs. I was captivated by the series when it aired, as it centered on a really interesting philosophical premise. And by the way, spoiler alert, skip ahead a couple of minutes if you don't want to find out the central plotline of the TV series. But here goes. Devs envisioned the creation of an all-knowing computer that could map the past and future with unerring accuracy. Why? Well, here's the show's tech billionaire come evil genius explaining.
The universe is deterministic. It's godless and neutral and defined only by physical laws. The marble rolls because it was pushed. The man eats because he's hungry. An effect is always the result of a prior cause. The life we lead, with all its apparent chaos, is actually a life on tram lines. Prescribed, undeviating, deterministic. I know it doesn't feel that way, Sergei. We fall into an illusion of free will because the tram lines are invisible. And we feel so certain about our subjective state. Our feelings, our opinions, judgments, decisions.
That is actually a pretty good explanation of physical determinism. But this belief isn't just a fun idea in the world of science fiction, it's come to be a key tenet of atheist materialism, that we live in a clockwork universe. You see, if nature is ultimately a machine, then its mechanisms, once set in motion, need no external intervention to do what they do. The cogs and wheels of the machine run automatically. Likewise, in a universe that consists entirely of physical causes and effects, there is no freedom to maneuver or change the outcome. Every molecule in existence has a path it will necessarily follow from the beginning of time until the end of time. Every single physical event, from the orbits of the planets to the movements of electrons in our brains, follow predictable laws of cause and effect. Therefore, the way that everything in the universe is now is a direct result of the way it was when it first began, and it could never have been otherwise. But what does that mean in practice? Well, an awful lot, it turns out. This is Stanford neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky telling Alex O'Connor why he believes our experience of free will is an illusion.
There's no free will whatsoever. That there's all sorts of points where we think we're seeing it, because we're looking in the wrong place, we're having a very strong emotional pull towards seeing it, but that there actually is none whatsoever when you look at the cumulative ways in which you turned out to be who you are and how what came before determined that. There is none. That's all we are. We are the outcome of the biological environmental luck that started way back when, up to a second ago, and there's no me inside your brain that's in your brain but not of your brain, and it's made of something separate, and that somehow is immune to things like your blood glucose levels or your genes or what culture you were brought up in, or whether you're worrying about paying the month's rent, and that's like the main thing on your mind. There is no separate me in there.
As Sapolsky says, in his materialist philosophy of determinism, human choice evaporates. Every thought, feeling, or decision you've ever made was not really made by you at all. They were made by the inevitable outworking of a series of circumstances over which you have no control. That includes your genetics and your environment, but it ultimately boils down to the interaction of atoms and electrons in your brain, over which you also have no control. In fact, there is no you to speak of. When you become one more constituent in a predetermined process, you are no longer the operator at the wheel, but simply a cog in the machine. If you wound the clock back a minute, a day, a year, or a lifetime to the exact same physical state, then every thought, feeling, and decision you have ever made would play out in exactly the same way. Sam Harris wrote a whole book, Free Will. Here he is explaining to Lex Friedman why he thinks we don't have it at a brain level.
If you're deciding what to, where to go for dinner, or who to have on your podcast, or ultimately, who to marry, right? Or what city to move to, right? Like you can make it as big or as small a decision as you want. We could be scanning your brain in real time, and at a point where you still think you're uncommitted, we would be able to say with arbitrary accuracy, all right, Lex he's moving to Austin, right?
I didn't choose that.
Yeah, it was going to be Austin or it was going to be Miami. He's catching one of these two waves, but it's going to be Austin. And at a point where you subjectively, if we could ask you, you would say, "Oh no, I'm still working over here. I'm still thinking."
But this absolute belief in determinism and the illusion of free will is very difficult to reconcile with other beliefs firmly held by many atheists. For example, here's TV personality and atheist Stephen Fry recently promoting the secular campaign group Humanists UK.
I'm Stephen Fry, and I'm proud to call myself a humanist and a patron of Humanists UK. Humanists UK represents millions of non-religious people all over the country who believe in a tolerant and empathetic society where rational thinking and kindness prevail. Humanists are people like me who try to live the best and fullest lives we can now because we believe that this life is the only one we've got.
This is all good, heartwarming stuff about reason and kindness and choosing to live the best and fullest lives we can, which, frankly, a lot of religious people could sign up to as well. In fact, as we've previously explored, secular humanism itself is arguably Christian moral ethics, stripped of its theistic underpinnings. But the problem specifically for an atheist like Stephen Fry is that if determinism is true and we don't have free will, then there is no choosing to be kind or trying to live our best lives involved at all. Whether you turn out to be generous and compassionate or turn out to be a moral monster, you had no choice in the matter. It was determined for you by the inexorable physical outworking of the universe before you were even born. There's very little point recommending the ethics of humanism to others if they have no choice whether they'll abide by them or not. That's why a philosopher like Daniel Dennett has to admit his determinism completely undercuts any sense of moral blame.
We have to give up some of the ideology about freedom. Yeah. We also have to give up something, and good riddance to it, about blame and responsibility. We have to realize that being responsible for what you do is not quite as earth-shakingly, metaphysically awful or terrible or wonderful as the tradition would have it.
That would scare some people.
I think so. They want to be absolutist about responsibility. And I'm saying, the idea of just in the eyes of God, sin, that has to go.
But it's not just a religious sense of right or wrong that this deterministic acid burns through. It raises the question of whether our systems of justice make any sense and whether we should do anything to punish or praise anyone in our world, as Robert Sapolsky explains.
Blame and punishment never make any sense whatsoever in any realm of human life. And holding a mirror up to that, likewise, praise and reward never make any sense whatsoever, because that's the circumstance in which some people are treated better than average for reasons they had nothing to do with, as opposed to the world of people being treated worse than average for reasons they... Blame, punishment, reward, praise, a sense of entitlement, a sense that you have earned anything, a sense that hating a person is ever justified. None of those make any sense whatsoever. And in principle, you need to run the world without any of that stuff, which ain't a trivial task to take on.
The problem, of course, is that we can't create a world where we don't hold people accountable for the wrong they do and refuse to reward them for the good they do, because that is simply not the way we experience the world. What we actually experience is a world full of moral right and wrong. Indeed, as Christian thinker William Lane Craig spelled out in a debate with Sam Harris, this is the problem with a materialist philosophy. It denudes the world of the concept of right and wrong altogether.
Moral responsibility, he says, and I quote, is a social construct, not an objective reality. I quote, in neuroscientific terms, no person is more or less responsible than any other for the actions they perform. His thoroughgoing determinism spells the end of any hope or possibility of objective moral duties, because on his worldview, we have no control over what we do. Thus, on Dr. Harris's view, there is no source of objective moral duties, because there is no moral lawgiver, and no possibility of objective moral duty, because there is no free will. Therefore, on his view, despite his protestations to the contrary, right and wrong do not really exist.
Of course, the great irony is that many of the new atheists like Sam Harris have spent a lot of time talking about right and wrong and the evils of religion versus the moral benefits of science and reason. But as Craig points out, if we actually have no freedom to choose and morality itself boils down to the outworking of a predetermined set of brain processes we have no control over, then isn't any such language about morality utterly pointless? That is one of the reasons why I believe the sunny optimism of secular humanism is self-contradictory, and ultimately the story of atheist determinism is incoherent, because it's unlivable. But in my view, it gets worse, much worse. Here's Richard Dawkins hosting a TV documentary titled The Enemies of Reason.
As a scientist, I don't think our indulgence of irrational superstition is harmless. I believe it profoundly undermines civilization. Reason and a respect for evidence are the source of our progress, our safeguard against fundamentalists and those who profit from obscuring the truth. We live in dangerous times when superstition is gaining ground and rational science is under attack. In this program, I want to take on the enemies of reason.
Again, there's nothing wrong with reason and evidence as important tools in establishing truth about the nature of reality. But in my view, Richard Dawkins, who is on record as a determinist, faces another serious internal incoherency even here. Many atheists have admitted they need to let go of notions of objective right and wrong in a deterministic universe, but have at least taken comfort in the fact they still have logic, evidence, and reason on their side. But I believe that if physical determinism is true, then not only does morality disappear, but so does the very concept of reason itself.
If a scientist actually claims that he's driven to determinism by his theories, then he can't be rational in accepting his theories.
This is Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland explaining why determinism undercuts the very concept of making rational, evidence-based decisions about what to believe.
Because the very rationality of accepting a scientific theory presupposes freedom. You have to assume that you chose to believe this theory based upon the evidence, not that you were determined to accept the theory for irrational physical causes. If everything I believe is determined by irrational atoms in motion, then my beliefs can't be accepted because I choose them on the basis of their rational credentials. And so the claim that all of my beliefs are determined by physical factors is self-refuting. It's like the statement, there are no sentences longer than 3 words.
So, are you keeping up? We're wading into some deep philosophical territory here, but here's my attempt at explaining this problem. If our beliefs are themselves the result of an undirected, predetermined process that boils down to the movements of atoms in our head, then how can we claim to have based those beliefs on reason or evidence? As Moreland explained, surely any process of reasoning requires the freedom to be able to associate one idea with another, to weigh the evidence, and using logic and inference, come to a considered belief. Most atheists I know say that this process is precisely why they are atheists and why they believe in determinism. They reasoned themselves into their naturalism. But if the thoughts we have and the reasoning process itself are completely outside of our control, being instead the inevitable result of a deterministic physical process, how can any of us claim to have used reason or logic to arrive at our beliefs? In a purely deterministic understanding of ourselves and our universe, no one arrives at their beliefs through a process of reason. The atheist believes in atheism simply because their brain chemistry fizzes one way, and the Christian believes in theism because their brain fizzes another way. but there's nothing true or false about the fizzing of brain chemistry. Therefore, the idea that we choose our beliefs on the basis of reason and evidence is yet another illusion. In fact, our beliefs were handed to us by the universe from the moment the great clockwork machine was set in motion. It could never have been otherwise. Look, I might be missing something, and I am happy to be corrected, but I'm constantly surprised that so few atheists who believe in both determinism and rationality see this contradiction in their worldview. A few years ago, I took part in a debate at Oxford University opposite well-known atheist YouTuber Stephen Woodford, aka Rationality Rules, and in the Q&A, we got into this very subject.
There's no reason to believe you're having true beliefs because they're simply the product of non-rational processes in your brain. That's the problem. At every level, it doesn't make sense. It completely undercuts itself. Part of my journey was reading C.S. Lewis, and if you read his book Miracles, he makes this case for the argument from reason, it's called. And it was like a penny dropped in my mind, and I thought, wow, this makes sense. How can you believe in reason if you believe we live in an entirely naturalistic universe?
It seems to me that what you're pressing on there is the idea that we don't know anything with certainty, or I can't because of my worldview. Is that?
I'd say that's certainly a consequence of it, yes, but also just the fact that you can't really even believe in truth, beauty, right, wrong, anything. It's all just atoms.
But it really depends on the definition of what we use for truth. If we say that something is absolutely certain, no, I reject that. I think Immanuel Kant was right. Was it Immanuel Kant? Whoever said...
but even in saying that, I reject that, that's not you saying that. It's just
so it is me.
It's just the deterministic process that happened to lead to the point where words come out of your mouth that have those particular syllables.
So the fact that an earthquake is determined, it's still an earthquake.
I know, and it's in that sense completely non-purposeful on your view.
I wouldn't say so. We're arguing about, I guess, where the essence lays, and that is that I think that you can call me an entity, you. The fact that I'm not, that I'm determined by either deterministic processes or by randomness, you still have a me.
I do, but I don't have one with any free will or reason. That's the problem. And you're called Rationality Rules.
The link to my full conversation with Stephen Woodford is in the show notes. And as I said, if you want a much fuller explanation, go and read Miracles by C.S. Lewis. In the end, this is why I believe when an atheist confidently affirms their belief in determinism, they're rather like the person who has climbed a tree and is now confidently soaring away at the branch they're sitting on. It is a self-defeating philosophy that radically undercuts itself. We're supposed to believe things on the basis of reason and evidence, yet if determinism is true, then anyone who professes such a belief only holds to it for non-rational reasons, including their belief in determinism itself. This vicious circle seems inescapable for the materialist. So is there any way of grounding free will and saving morality and reason in the process? Back to my big conversation between Keith Ward and Daniel Dennett, which included this humorous moment when I became the subject of a thought experiment as they hashed out whether determinism makes sense.
If we were to hand you a gun right now, and I were to suggest to you, well, why don't you shoot Justin in the arm? I'm not going to get...
Thank you. We won't demonstrate this practically.
Why don't you just to prove you have free will, shoot him in the arm. Now...
I might surprise you.
You might, but you won't. And you won't because you know better. And your prior experience makes this... I'd bet very, very large sums of money. You're not going to do it. And it's going to be a free choice. And you just better hope that it's not an undetermined choice, because if it were, then you might suddenly find yourself doing it in spite of all of your previous...
My view is not that you would find yourself doing it, but that you could decide to do it, which is very different.
Well, who's the you that's doing this deciding?
Well, I've got a you, you see. You might not have a you, but you've just got a brain. I've got a you. So I've got a self. The subject self, which is the soul in Christian terms, is also an agent self, so it has a certain... agency, which it decides between courses of action. So it is not determined by its past behavior. Now, in the case, I would not actually shoot Justin, but there are things I would do to Justin if you ask me to. And
I'm feeling worried here, but yeah, carry on. Keith Ward here was expressing an alternative perspective to determinism, libertarian free will. He doesn't deny that he's very unlikely to shoot me, however much money Dennett offered him, but that's not because Keith's past has predetermined his actions, but because he actively chooses not to shoot me on the basis of his moral convictions. Practically speaking, libertarian free will is how we all actually live our lives, believing that there is a real independent me, capable of making free decisions, a me who chooses moral or not so moral actions, a me guilty of wrongdoing or worthy of praise, and ultimately a me able to trust my ability to freely come to reasoned conclusions. Now, as far as I can see, the only way we can trust in the idea of morality and rationality is if we live in a universe in which free will actually exists, and in which materialism therefore is false, which means a universe in which there is something or someone beyond the physical world that acts as a guarantor of morality and reason. J.P. Moreland.
And so you might say that when a human being exercises libertarian free action, they're performing a miracle. They're actually introducing an effect into the world that is not fixed by the other states of the world and the laws of physics.
How then do you look upon the importance of free will as a key determinant of your theology?
I think the importance of free will is absolutely critical, because I think that human freedom is a reflection of the image of God. God has free creativity. We do too as his image bearers. I think free will is important for solving where evil came from and why we can be held morally accountable for our actions and our beliefs. And I think free will is awfully important in being a co-laborer with God and exploring the universe he made.
Inevitably, this brief exploration is only scratching the surface of a huge topic. We could have talked about Libet's brain experiments, compatibilism, and much more. You'll have to read the book version of this podcast for the full story. However, there's far more at stake here than philosophical point scoring. Materialism, along with its twin sister determinism, has become the default view in large parts of academia. But it has also filtered down into the way many everyday people engage their lives. I believe this materialist view of reality is the background assumption that many people in the West now live by, that nature is a machine and we are insignificant cogs within it, that there's no ultimate meaning to the choices we make, that we're simply being herded along by a vast, undirected and uncaring universe in which, as Richard Dawkins has famously put it, there is no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But what we believe about reality has real-world consequences. Ian McGilchrist.
But I also think it's naive and dangerous to suggest to people that they're wholly programmed. And indeed, we know that when people believe that they act in a much less moral and imaginative way than if they believe that they actually have agency. So it has a deleterious effect on their ethical being.
Like McGilchrist, I think that the underlying story of materialist determinism is feeding into the meta-crisis, the mental health crisis, and the meaning crisis, all exacerbated by the dehumanizing effects of modern technology. When we cut adrift from the shared Christian story that once invested our lives with significance and agency, and instead conceive of our place in the universe as meaningless and arbitrary, it shouldn't surprise us when we collectively detour into distracted, anxious, and even nihilistic directions. I was sad when the world lost Daniel Dennett, but I have to admit, I would not be sad to lose his worldview. We need a better story of reality than the one New Atheism offered us. But I'm hopeful that it is already happening, that the materialist story of reality is being overturned in our generation. Next time we'll meet some of the thinkers, both with and without faith, who are fighting back for meaning, and we'll explore more of Iain McGilchrist's own story, his influential work on the brain, and why he has found the courage to put God back in the conversation. Perhaps most excitingly of all, I believe there is a way through the modern meaning crisis, and there are some very surprising people finding it. As I promised earlier, we're going to conclude today's episode by hearing how Jordan Hall's story has played out. As we heard, he made his fortune as a young tech genius, but in doing so had been exposed to just how quickly the world was changing, as environmental, social and technological pressures drove people towards isolation, nihilism and conflict. He became caught up in a quest, along with other tech pioneers and thinkers, to steer the world away from this looming meta-crisis. Surprisingly, in only the past year or so, he believes he has reached an unexpected answer to this massive and complex problem, and it's called Christianity. My conversation with Jordan took place on Zoom from his home in the small town of Black Mountain near Asheville, North Carolina, where he now lives with his family. But the journey to the life they now share there was a long and winding one. As I soon discovered, Jordan is not only a deep thinker, but also an all-in kind of guy. Rewind back several years, and he had decided that the only way to find a solution to the meaning and meta-crisis engulfing our world was to think outside the box. Deeply influenced by thinkers such as John Vervaeke and Iain McGilchrist, he had decided that trying to solve the problem with the same Western, industrialized, materialist, deterministic, reductionistic mindset that had created the problem wasn't good enough. He needed to change his thinking altogether. And so Jordan took a radical step and with his family began to immerse himself in other communities and worldviews in the hope that he might find a new way of confronting the meaning crisis, not just in the wider world, but within himself.
Well, that was the journey. And I and my wife and took that journey fully. We dove into it. And so part of it was an exposure to a variety of different lineages and traditions, mostly Eastern, as it turns out, that had presented themselves as having techniques, what John Vervaeke would call psychotechnologies, that were good at that. So we went to on an RV trip, dropping in over a period of months across the United States, dropping into about 16 different places, different groups and communities, learning what was happening in different places and who had different, in this case, psychotechnology or pieces of the story, or maybe, hey, this was the right place for us to put our family and just dive in all the way. We spent time in British Columbia. We spent time in Kauai. We spent time in Ecuador. And here we're meeting months to many months. And in each case, by the way, not with a recognition that we had to be able to commit to this might be it. And so drop all the way in and do the thing, live here and see what it looks like. Again, because of this liminal problem. I mean, you can't do that scientist thing and try to stand outside of reality and judge reality when that's the problem. Mm-hmm. So you have to be in, right, all the way in, which is very uncomfortable, I should say. I would not recommend it. It's hazardous for all kinds of things, including physical health.
This wisdom-seeking journey involved experiencing many diverse traditions, communities and philosophies, and those psychotechnologies Jordan mentions can include meditation, ritual and psychedelics. Yet Jordan found that none of it ultimately worked, leaving him physically and emotionally spent.
So then we ended up at the bottom of the bottom, meaning every effort had ultimately failed in ways that were perfectly surprising, perfectly demoralizing, perfectly humbling. And we sort of had retreated from our last effort to literally my parents' ranch in Texas, where I was convalescing from nearly dying physically and definitely spiritually. And my wife said, we should go to Asheville, which is the bigger town next to Black Mountain. And I said, okay, shrug of shoulders. And it was the last place on the list that we hadn't actually gone. But then we have the last piece, which is because that's what God told us to do. So that we didn't know that at the time, but a lot of what had been learned was something like a sensitivity to a feeling, a quality of feeling that now I would say is the Holy Spirit. But nonetheless, ability to have a sensitivity to that quality of feeling and a willingness to make choices on that basis. So, right, bracketed in, nowhere else to go. One last sort of box to check. And also a weirdly, like a flickering flame in an otherwise blown out ember. We mustered just enough energy to straggle into Asheville. And we just booked a place in Black Mountain. And miraculously enough, it happened to be during a celebration or a festival called Holly Jolly, proximal to Christmas, where everything's decorated in lights and everybody's outside and there's groups of people singing and, gingerbread and whatnot, which is deeply wholesome and real, by the way, not the least bit. Well, only a sliver of performance, and nurturing to a tired soul, to a weary soul. And so we went back to Texas after that and said, okay, this is it. We're going to make it. We're going to make a stake and make an effort to make our life there. With very little hope, to be honest, but at least a glimmer of hope. And so we did.
It turned out that their last hope, the lakeside town of Black Mountain, seemed to embody the sense of community that Jordan and his family had been looking for all along.
The fruits, by the fruits you shall know them. A series of shocking experiences of ordinary wholesomeness, of just friendly people inviting you to come to their porch and have a chat. Of my daughter having, we called it grandmother hunting, just finding old ladies, entering into conversations with them anywhere, on a walk in the neighborhood, sitting in a coffee shop over by the lake, and her flourishing, my daughter flourishing. This is very good. Just being invited into something and finding it easy to do all the things that we had theoretically identified were definitely necessary for anything like community. And this term wholesomeness, just a presence of wholesomeness. And I remember walking right over there to my neighbor's house after about a month and a half and saying, all right, guys, when's the other shoe going to drop? Because it feels like this can't actually be reality. It's just too good to be reality. And the husband smiled and he said, well, I've been here 40 years and the other shoe ain't dropped yet. And me going, good enough for me. Right? I'm willing to take the rest on faith because of that acceptance of just, we're going to flow with what's being invited here. It's just an invitation. We're going to participate in it. Being invited to a big potluck after meeting somebody after a week into their house in the intimacy of relationships that are 40 years or more older, and being, feeling comfortable with that. And then being invited to a birthday party right over there with people we hadn't met yet. We didn't know this family at all. A family we knew a little bit said, well, you ought to come to this birthday party. And I'm feeling the British in you going, that seems extremely improper. Even me going, that seems weird, but okay, why not? What do I know? I clearly know nothing. And that's the invitation, we'll take it. And then in that place, 2 different people invited my wife to come to their church.
As we heard earlier, Jordan has no Christian background. Indeed, Christianity was the one worldview, the one tradition he had discounted in his esoteric quest to find a meaningful solution to the meta-crisis. But what if the answer had been on his doorstep all along?
As it turns out, the next Sunday, I was already booked to go to an AI conference in San Francisco, which I hadn't been to San Francisco in like 5 years. And then my wife ended up driving down to the little country church 5 minutes from here. We both had our experience. We compared notes. I reported from the field. Things are as bad as I expected and are clearly going to be getting worse. She said, it turns out this church thing is pretty good. Do you think the pastor would be willing to come talk to us at our house? I said, I don't know. You can ask him. And in many senses, sort of from there, everything just sort of continued. The next Sunday, I went to church, with the exception of the summer where we couldn't get our Airbnb renewed, so we had to go back to my parents' place. We haven't missed a Sunday, or Wednesday, by the way. And it just continued to pile on more and more. So that was, about this time last year, almost exactly this time last year.
Jordan was surprised to find that the sermons he was listening to and the scriptures they drew upon spoke to him in ways he hadn't expected. even when he heard things he disagreed with, he described to me the feeling of being convicted despite himself. But most of all, in the fragmented and angry world he saw looming ahead, it was the community he encountered in a small rural church that convinced Jordan that there was a hope for a different way of living.
The church itself is quite unassuming. One might even say ugly. But the people and their relationships, shockingly beautiful. Particularly relationships at the family level, kids, teenagers with parents and grandparents. And all right, from a theoretic perspective, that's what it should look like. This is what a healthy community looks like, feels like, even smells like. There's the incense of life in the room, potently, psychedelically. If the experience actually was closer to a psychedelic experience than not. Okay. And then I was in a pickle. I was in a conundrum. Because, of course, then I have the problem of theology, which is, it turns out this is the right order. Beauty first, good second. Okay, what about truth? I can't honestly, earnestly, I yearned to participate. I wanted to be part of this community in life, but it felt deeply disingenuous to endeavor to be so, but not actually to, at the very least, deeply dive into what it is that they believed and that they at least thought was central to what was holding them together. So I did. Much of it was digital first. So much of it was, for me, online, including finding out ways to produce theologians to dialogue with using ChatGPT. I've had long conversations with Augustine and Aquinas and C.S. Lewis, and have them had conversations with each other, by the way. Reading scripture, reading the Apostolic Fathers and the Patristic Fathers, and all of it endeavoring at least to solve the 5 sort of big things that were coming up for me as stuff that I couldn't swallow. I couldn't swallow the historicity, the actual, this is an historical event, that Christ was a real guy and he really was crucified and really was reborn. The problem of what the crucifixion actually is, the notion of all the theological terms,
atonement and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and the idea of somebody taking a punishment that I'm supposed to have, that blood solves, like all that, and sacrifice, that's a big question. And then, of course, even deeper, what even means, not just why, but what. The Trinity. And then the last one is my favorite because it's so funny how it ends up, is the challenge of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. Just to give you like a front, each one, I said that in that order because they got resolved in that order. And then the last one, I struggled with mightily because I read a lot of different theological efforts, but my mind kept going, no, it didn't work. Sorry, guys. You're waving your hands at very important concepts, and you can all mutually criticize each other, and your criticisms are accurate. So the theology is incoherent. I don't, by the way, and I've investigated pretty deeply, not lifetimes, but into all the various versions of it. And, so I had a conversation with a friend of mine who has spent his whole life in it. And he said, well, what does it matter for your life? Are you able to live a Christian life in spite of the fact that you can't make sense of these 2 principles? Can you hold divine foreknowledge as true? Yeah. Can you hold human responsibility and freedom as true? Yes. Can you live accordingly? Yes. Okay. Then consider the possibility that this is above your pay grade and may forever be above your pay grade. Not the kind of thing that you're meant to understand. And that's the key lesson. And I remember just having that experience again of convicted. Oh, right, something landed. Oh, right. It's the opposite, right? This thing is not subject to my ability to understand it. That's not what it is. So what does it mean to live that way, right? And that's the shift from the epistemological into episteme, into pistis, right, into faith.
Was that kind of the point at which you realized, having put these pieces together, you could make that confession? You could say, yes, I'm in?
I wish I was true. But then I had to deal with being afraid of the fact that it's culturally improper to be a confessed Christian. So I had to struggle with that for about 2 weeks. It's funny how the mind works. Like I convinced myself that in my heart I could be a Christian and I could participate, but not talk about it publicly. And of course, part of that is proper. This isn't a performance. This doesn't exist for the purposes of talking about publicly. But even a public confession in the sense of being baptized. But the right response or the right answer is to pray, and to pray on it deeply. And so I prayed on it deeply. And there's a certain point in time, my wife knows exactly when, she's looking at me going, And I said, yeah, I'm getting baptized tomorrow, like ASAP, where it was just very clear to me that right action, the only right thing to do was to get baptized, like to continue to live and not get baptized was deeply out of integrity, deeply untrue, and therefore deeply wrong. And the opposite is also the case. To do so was deeply right and quite beautiful.
Despite all the negative assumptions he carried about church and faith, Jordan has jumped into the Christian stream and found the water there deeper and more refreshing than he could have imagined. I asked him why, despite the many failings and problems that beset today's church, he believes he has found there the traditions, teaching and way of living in the world that can address our increasingly individualized, disembodied and dehumanized technological future.
Something's happening now because we're entering into a distinctly different moment. That is profound in consequence. And you notice, for example, that a lot of what's happening is in this weird new form of video conversation or audio conversation, but it's no longer strictly oral, meaning spatially and temporally, it no longer is bound to the location where I'm speaking. You're not here. You're there. And other people in time will be able to hear this or even perhaps see this. That's a new kind of thing. And if we'd like, we can actually have AI read it and then produce an animated version of it. This is the digital, right? Media is exploding to its fulfillment. There's a whole series of videos I did with John Vervaeke and Greg Henriquez on exactly this, that we're at the fulfillment of all possible media. It's an important thing to keep in mind, which is going to say something profound about the nature of what it means to try to produce a church to embody the body of Christ. And so we know that we're dealing with deeply traumatized and therefore deeply sinful individuals. We know that we're dealing with an exit from a wineskin that is bursting in every direction. We know that we are having to find some way of embodying or construct new wineskins, or maybe even find a way to construct things that construct wineskins as the flow of living wine becomes much more than anything we've ever experienced before in the past. And we also know that at the end of the day, both the end and the beginning and the way is the body of Christ, which is mysterious in nature, which means that the proper approach is in prayer. The proper approach is in faith. And to find a way to go deeper and deeper in being able to do that. Right? This is a key thing. Right? It's not that prayer is not sort of like a on-off switch. Prayer is let's say a skill or an art. There's an artfulness to it and a commitment to it that is as potent as any other kind of art. Like if you learn to play guitar, you notice that you're not very good at it, and then you get better. And at a certain point, you begin to be able to do it where you disconnect from the thinking of it, and you begin to be able to connect with something from which music is created, and your heart begins to guide your fingers in a fluid fashion, and it produces something in the world that changes the hearts of others. Prayer is like that. Prayer is a kind of instrumentality of the expression of the divine into reality.
Jordan Hall's conversion to Christianity shocked many of his peers, but I think surprised himself most of all. Faced with this burgeoning meaning crisis, many like Jordan have tried to find solutions in the form of the mindfulness revolution. There's been an explosion in pop psychology books, courses and apps aiming to soothe our anxiety and develop positive habits for mental health, often drawing on ancient forms of wisdom to do so. Now, these are welcome developments insofar as they help stressed and anxious people to find a sense of equilibrium. Even Sam Harris has reinvented himself in recent years as a mindfulness guru with his own popular meditation app and podcast. But these attempts to redeploy ancient wisdom through modern technology and psychology and even psychedelics still feel like a temporary fix rather than a solution. The optimistic slogans of humanists who insist that we must make our own meaning are well-intentioned, but as long as their best minds are also reminding us that we are accidental collocations of atoms for whom personhood and free will are an illusion, their efforts will always be a placebo rather than a cure. is there a way back from this crisis? I'm confident there is, and that in the stories of people like Jordan Hall and others we've heard from today, we are again beginning to see the turning of the tide. It begins with recognizing that we've been living in the wrong story for too many years. The materialist, determinist paradigm of the universe is an atheistic assumption supported by neither science nor philosophy. We need not be compelled to live in such a non-story. There is a better story. The story of a God who chose, in love, to create free creatures, capable of deciding between right and wrong, capable of reason, and ultimately capable of love. It's a story in which we've all misused that freedom to create a world on a collision course with death. But love also drove that God to enter the story himself in Jesus, someone who chose willingly to give himself up for those he had created so that you, me, and everyone has the opportunity to be reconciled to God, to each other, and to ourselves, and emerge from the meaning crisis. Maybe the story we're searching for has been waiting for us all along. You've been listening to the surprising rebirth of belief in God, telling the story of how new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Material from The Unbelievable Show was used by permission of Premier. Visit premierunbelievable.com for full shows, or today's show notes for links to all archived materials used in this episode. And just to remind you, this podcast series is also a book. You can read the first chapter for free when you join my newsletter. That's at justinbrierley.com. You can go there and order the book or get a signed copy. Supporting via Patreon or tax-deductible giving from the USA also gives you early access to new episodes of the podcast and access to bonus content. Gold supporters get signed copies of my books as well. Find out more and how to support these efforts of mine to bring thinking faith to the secular and Christian world at justinbrierley.com. The links are with today's show. Coming up next time.
Not everything that matters is matter and is measurable. Love, where do you measure that? How do you do it? He says that consciousness is an illusion, but I would point out that for it to be an illusion, there must be a consciousness to be eluded.
The Believing Brain, how Ian McGilchrist rediscovered the soul. We'll be diving into the mysterious world of consciousness. Today's episode was a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and support from the Jerusalem Trust. Editing assistance by Isaac Simmons. You can find links to the book and all our featured guests with the show notes. As ever, please do subscribe to this podcast, do rate us, review us, and tell others too. Share it on your social media, give it to a friend. It really helps other people to find this series. And you can get that next episode 2 weeks early when you support now at justinbrierley.com. Again, the link is with today's show. See you next time. Thanks for listening today, and to Ellis, who left this review saying, one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. Historical, insightful, reasoned, and full of heart. So necessary in a culture that has forgotten why it is like it is. Just bought the book too. If you can leave a review, it helps others to discover the show. And if you want to buy the book, like Ellis did, you can get a signed copy from my website. As it happens, gold supporters of this show get signed editions of both my books anyway, plus lots of bonus content and early access. And of course, your support makes a huge difference to me being able to produce this podcast. So for the book or to support, visit justinbrierley.com or follow the links with the show notes.